So Point Loma it's not an easy thing to describe or talk about because in a way we have, I'm going to make two broad generalities here. So we have, for example, Emmett Greenwald, the historian, wrote a book on Point Loma following the history from 1898 to 1942. So this is kind of what I would call the linear history. This follows, the idea of the development of the community, how it came, how Catherine Tingley came after Judge, and all these historical developments. All of it's very interesting. And then within those historical developments, you have the cultural inner aspects developing over that timeline. So I haven't drawn this out yet. I'm just going to try and do it, just very simply. So here we have So from one point of view, we can identify this period from 1898 to 1929 with Catherine Tingley. She dies in 1929 in Europe. And then the second part, short period of time, with de Purucker. So in the usual cultural development, historical points of view, things are seen as developing, they look at Tingley's background. Here she only enters Theosophy about 1894, 3 or 4. And this is kind of the usual linear perspective. So the other viewpoint, we try to look at this is not in time here. It would be encompassing maybe this way, the vertical dimension. So that would put a whole circle around it in a sense. So in that vertical dimension, then we try to look at the cultural elements outside of time. Look at the core elements. So within those core elements, we have in a sense two cycles. Again, these cycles are identified with these two leaders of the group here and how those things evolved. So in discussions with some of those who grew up and lived at Point Loma that then I grew up with, people like Gordon Plummer or Boris de Zurkov, my father, my mother, and Barborkas and Iverson Harris and people like that. Sometimes was discussed, and I think there's an article by Boris giving this general theme of the idea of mystery school. Again, the ancient mysteries, like at Eleusis in Greece and places like that, were broadly categorized into often into two levels. Lesser mysteries and greater mysteries. Not really that one is less or greater in that usual sense, but lesser mysteries provide the foundation for the greater mysteries. So at Point Loma, this period under Tingley could be called the foundation, or the lesser mysteries. And it's the foundation in a sense that it provided a daily practice, a daily foundation of what Tingley called Raja Yoga. It wasn't Raja Yoga from India. It was Raja Yoga theosophically being, in her definition, the balance of the faculties, body, soul, and spirit, putting it very broadly. That's the broad conceptual idea, but in actual practice at Point Loma, then it becomes even more specific. So there's some very unusual things about Point Loma as a community in terms of how the daily life was engaged in. One of the most unusual things was, especially for our current time with all of our, I mean, can you imagine, if Point Loma existed today, what do you think one of her first rules would be? I'm quite sure. Guess what? But guess what that would mean? No cell phones. Really, it would be, you know. No little internet. No. Would there be internet? Yes. Would we be able to use it for our chit chat and searching anything we like if Point Loma existed today? What do you think? Would she do it? Not a chance. Not a chance. And you find some people visiting Point Loma at the time quite unnerved by this. Here come a group of 20 children walking along. Quiet. Completely quiet. I think the international visitors that were instantly impressed and engaged this 1,000% were the early visitors who were from the educational system in Japan. For them, this was, wow, they couldn't believe it. They didn't think this existed in the Western world, but only in parts of Asia at that time. It was very unusual. The day started in silence, and we'll go later this afternoon. I think we'll begin at the Greek theater this time. So that everyone, the whole community, everyone living in the community, assembled at the Greek theater every morning in silence. And there'd be someone speaking or reciting some inspirational quotes from Voice of the Silence or Bhagavad Gita or Light on the Path or something like that. You know, maybe not continuously, maybe every 5 or 10 minutes, someone would give a keynote. So for half an hour, everyone sat there in silence. So today, language has changed, all kinds of influences have changed. And today we would, in many ways, Raja Yoga would equal mindfulness. As Tingley would say, do well the smallest duty and joy will come. This was the whole premise of Point Loma on that level. You would have to call it something like the Greek Western, Greek Egyptian mindfulness. Does this idea make sense with the idea that there are the foundation of the lesser mysteries? You know, in our Theosophical world, we are entering this through books, through study, which is very valid, very wonderful. And again, it might be a surprise to everyone, but was this the approach at Point Loma at the beginning under this first phase with Catherine Tingley? The Theosophists living at Point Loma in the evenings were sitting and having long discussions about Theosophy. No, they weren't. Not at all. So Catherine Tingley's idea, she felt that Theosophy had become too intellectual, too abstract, and not engaged in daily living enough. She took the whole movement at the time and made a serious directional turn. Very radical thing, really. How she pulled it off seems totally impossible. But nonetheless, it happened. She gathered up all the energies and all the people, and with her extraordinary charisma, pointed to the west, said, "We're going there." And everyone said, "Where is that?" She goes, "Well, I've never been there, but we're going there." Set up on a crusade around the world, 1898, with almost no money, not enough money to get to where she was going, even though she didn't know where she was going. But she did know. You know, halfway through that equation of, in Europe, she lands in Switzerland. She hears back from the person she says to buy land in this place called Point Loma. They send a notice back to her and say, "It's all government land, there's nothing available there." Well, this doesn't fit her vision. She thinks this is impossible, it has to be there. Then a young man at that time who's interested in already studying Theosophy and a member of the Theosophical Society under Judge has an appointment to see her there. And he's already been in Point Loma, and his name is Gottfried de Purucker. And there he, in that meeting, Iverson Harris was there. Purucker draws the map of Point Loma, showing that, yes, indeed, there is a piece of property that could be available next to the government property. Tingley sends a telegram to her agent in San Diego, and Point Loma is purchased based on that encounter. It's quite extraordinary, really. So that's kind of some of the history part. But again, her idea is to make Theosophy intensely practical, which she called the highest law of conduct of divine compassion, and to put that into an educational construction and community for children to be taught. And that's what evolved. Just in a period of about 2 years, Point Loma just explodes with energy and people and activity in the school and everything. Within it starts off with 6 students, literally. Iverson Harris and the Hanson sisters from Georgia are in that first group. And then I think just 1.5 years later, I think then it goes to 100, and then it goes up from there. At the peak of the community, there are perhaps 500 people living at Point Loma, more or less. So Tingley says, a pervasive thing. Think of Theosophy not so much as a body of philosophic or other teaching, but as the highest law of conduct, which is the enacted expression of divine love or compassion. I started this paper with a quote from a very unusual and great Tibetan prodigy. They often call the kind of the Da Vinci of Tibet, or at least one of them in more recent time. His name was Mipam, but I think this applies to all our Theosophic studies, so I'll repeat it. So Mipam says, it's called the 4 reliances. Rely on the message of the teacher, not his personality. Rely on the meaning, not just the words. Rely on the real meaning, not the provisional one. Rely on your wisdom mind, not your ordinary judgmental mind. Anyway, I just used that quote as a kind of theme to approaching everything. It very much fits the perspective of the Point Loma spirit in engaging everything we're studying and attempting to understand, I think. So again, at Point Loma, this was like a foundation. This foundation, some would accuse Tingley of being overly strict or overly very, maybe even regimented. This would be a kind of criticism even at that time. But was it really?
I was wondering about the individuals before the group met in silence. Were the adults before the group met in silence at the Greek theater in the morning, were they encouraged as individuals to do some meditative or some kind of practice before they went together, or was it the group only?
Oh, I think the group at that point. Again, this broad structure, you can see in the education of the time at Point Loma. So here they had a rigorous academic schedule, by all children in their, age 5 to 11, all had not English and Spanish and French. Maybe in Europe this may not seem so unusual, but in America we think this is quite unusual. And then in junior high school there was Greek and Latin for everyone, Greek, Latin. And then, mathematics and all the usual curriculum. And what's amazing about it is that was all done, school was done in the academic sense by lunchtime. Completely done, that was it. And then was all the engaged activities of usual things, of sports, but then also gardening was very much part of the curriculum of everybody, teachers and students. Everyone got dirty in the garden. Professor next to student with the radishes, this isn't done much in some of the progressive schools, perhaps, today. And then every day, one of the crucial, most pervasive elements at Point Loma that Tingley promoted very strongly was that every single person in the community would play a musical instrument and sing, even if you were completely tone deaf and didn't quite get which way the scale was going. Everyone participated, and there was a musical participation in group every day. Really quite extraordinary. And again, in studies of spiritual and intentional communities, at least I think globally, but especially in the Western world over the several hundred-year period, this is a prevailing theme of communities that worked well and had continuity, is they gathered in group and shared music together. This pervades monastic communities, all kinds of communities. And Tingley did it you'd almost have to call Point Loma in some ways we would call it, of course, a Theosophical community, but in modern language it might be called a unique humanistic monastery. Instead of mantras or Gregorian chant, no, we can play Mozart. Quite interesting. You can sing any number of classical musical compositions. Question?
Gardening was also in silence? Gardening in the afternoon?
Gardening, yeah.
Yeah, was also in silence?
Science.
Silence.
Oh, silence.
Yeah.
Well, silence was the atmosphere of the place. Silence was perhaps, of course, when you're interacting and you're doing your schoolwork and learning things, people are talking, of course. But for example, during meals, absolutely no talking, just like in a Zen monastery. Maybe. Yeah, so there would, of course, but there wouldn't be excessive chit-chat or casual talk. No, this was not a factor at Point Loma. It was quite, maybe some people would say it was extreme, but that was the way it was, really.
Can I prolong the question of Nicholas, for it's a very good one. In 24, GDP started to study with a group of Theosophists studying the fundamentals of esoteric philosophy. And somewhere in the day time during all those years, there must have been time for the adults to study the secret doctrine. Otherwise, he couldn't start that studies. And where in the whole scheme of her work is that included? For there were people knowing the secret doctrine. And it is like we are working now in The Hague. We are doing a lot together, organizing things. We only don't grow vegetables. Yes, but the other things are quite similar to Tingley's work, only behind that and within that, we study the secret doctrine only. We don't make it's our goal. Yes, it's a time of the day. We do that individually or whatever. It must have been done in Point Loma, otherwise GDP couldn't start with that group. So where does the study fit in?
Again, with this scheme, I'm trying to show the relationship of lesser mysteries and greater mysteries and the foundation that Tingley laid in time, that's true, but I'm trying to show this more importantly in the vertical dimension, where this becomes a template that we may learn a great deal from in terms of our own practice of understanding Theosophy within our own lives. Today, and I'm not avoiding your question, I'll get to it. I'm not avoiding your question, but I'm answering it in a circular manner. So, you know, I'm an individual student, I'm doing my study. Well, I can read this, I can read that, I can do this, I can do that. So and then we develop some schemes. No, there's kind of a progression. So that is well known. There's certain books and things to study and evolve from. That's good. You know, ideas unfold and they correspond with how those understandings unfold within us. So, in a sense, before getting to all that, Tingley wanted to lay a foundation that was really solid. Another thing people may not realize is that in the Raja Yoga school was Theosophy taught. The Raja Yoga school, meaning for the children starting at age 5 up through high school, was Theosophy taught. In the specific sense, the answer is no. In the deep sense, in general sense, the answer is yes. So again, this was a way of inculcating in the students through example and through the environment. Again, as education means to draw out from within and not just conditioned from the outside. So Point Loma was working at this idea of drawing out from within the potential of each person and student, given the right support in a group sense, for these things to come naturally. And then specifically, again, I don't know how people at Point Loma had time to do what they did. I mean, maybe they didn't sleep much, but really there was no group study, again, of technical theosophy, you might call it. It did not happen in group. Individually, of course, there were extraordinary scholars of a whole variety there. You know, everything from, you know, Mayan scholar William Gates to Fred Dick's understanding of sacred geometry and Henry T. Edge's philosophy, or Charles Ryan's astronomy, archaeology, whatever. But again, in the dimension of things, this is like the broad scope was to lay this foundation of extraordinarily practical theosophy for Catherine Tingley. Perhaps
she was just trying to follow I've forgotten whether it was HPB or one of the teachers, for progress to be made, all the disciples, or at least in this case, the members of the Brotherhood, have to be as fingers of one hand, really in harmony, work together. So that foundation was being laid by all the shared group activities, quiet, so that it could become a harmonious group foundation. And of course, individuals, as early as 1906, the Theosophical manuals were being cranked out, and these were obviously from students who knew what they were doing.
Definitely.
It may not have been in a group, but I think that was her foundation, is to get this brotherhood, active, universal brotherhood, the nucleus, well-formed, and then you can add in the study as a group later on.
That's true. That's one of the elements you could say that was in that whole picture. We can, as we try to elaborate this, we could list the qualitative elements of what were contained in this practice of the lesser mysteries that Tingley was evolving at Point Loma. Dara?
What about the lotus circles? Didn't they plant seeds for the children for their future studies? Yeah.
Sure, there was the Lotus Circle, and then it had a magazine for the children, Lotus Circle Messenger. There was another magazine also that would go to all the prisons, all the prisoners. And again, you look at it, and with those contents of those writings there, and you find the broad principles of Theosophy are all there, very much, but not in the specific sense. It was creating this really broad spectrum of understanding so that it could be, a lot of, San Diego families would send their students to Point Loma because the quality of the education was so high, for example.
And of course, G2P and a few others worked on doing the first Secret Doctrine edition in 1906 or 7 of the Secret Doctrine. And
yeah, Fred Dick worked on the ISIS.
So there was always a core of people who would
Sure.
do that sort of thing.
Yeah, because here you had a number of people who were direct students of Blavatsky living there. Herbert Koren, H.T. Edge, Fred Dick, all knew Blavatsky, and Judge, So they, and others. Patterson, yeah. So here's another core idea from Tingley. It's in her trip to India in the late 1890s. She's in Darjeeling, and she suddenly tells everyone she wants to go up to the mountains somewhere, and she has someone, and they head up into the mountains above Darjeeling, and she leaves most everyone behind. I'm not sure who was with her at the final encounter, but there she says she meets Blavatsky's teacher in person. The only more strange curiosity about it is that she very clearly describes a younger Tibetan. A younger Tibetan as Blavatsky's teacher. Anyway, not. So I'm not sure who that was exactly. Could be.
More than one teacher, so.
Perhaps, yeah. Anyway, so in that encounter, she describes in these words. She's quoting him. Well, she's giving her impression of the encounter. Who is this? So this is quoting from him to her. If you had to go from here to America, Blavatsky's teacher continued, you would not sit still and dream about the place you wanted to go to and think that was enough. The trouble with some Theosophical aspirants is that they waste the strength of their lives looking at the goal ahead rather than at the immediate moments and seconds of which the path is composed. And so their better selves become exhausted. They should let the beaming thought pour itself into each arriving moment and be indifferent to the morrow. One can find in every instant of time, if one has the desire, the door into worlds of golden opportunity, the gateway to a glorious path stretching out into the limitless eternal. To move away from the material plane of effort and thought and personality, that is what the soul is urging us to do. To move out into the hidden vast realities of life and understand that within and above and around us, and in the very atmosphere in which our thoughts and feeling exist, universal life is pulsating continuously in response to our yearnings and questionings. When people are saying that they are seeking happiness, they mean that they are aiming at a stage in their evolution where their present problems will be solved. To reach it, one must withdraw from the allurements of life and all its outward and discouraging aspects and find himself in the solitude of his own being, in a silence unbreakable within his own heart and mind. The outer life is transient. He must gain the inner power and live in the spirit which is eternal. He cannot step free-souled into that light without having learned concentration, for concentration is a power inherent in the self, capital S, self, and above and beyond the mind. Selfishness attains, selfishness defeats. Men's possibilities are in direct proportion to their ability to see beyond themselves and to feel for others. The trouble is with many of our aspirants that too often they begin with the letter and go backwards in search of the spirit. But let them hold to these things in the silence and create a noble future in their hearts, going alone in the morning into the silence of nature, freeing themselves there from their old trying memories and from all anticipations of trouble. Let them make themselves at one with that light in nature. And it will not hurt them to look at the stars with wonder occasionally, or to listen with delight to the music of the birds, or to spend whole days in silence, brooding on these sacred things while performing all the duties that come to them. A very essential kind of view. It's like a view. So I think within the Point Loma, these two, like it's not really two, they're all together, but I'm calling them two just to look at them, you know? So that within this foundation and then these inner part, which we'll get to, there's a viewpoint. So Point Loma's, and part of Tingley's whole approach was to establish this really vast view, and very, very intimate view of this huge, expansive, and very present potential. She would always lament those stuck in their brain mind. She said we have to go beyond the brain mind. This was one of her key elements. Any comments yet again, or shall I continue? It's getting quiet in here. So music is pervasive at Point Loma. This daily do well, the smallest duty, this kind of Raja Yoga mindfulness is present at Point Loma. And within that, all these activities and everything frequently on a couple of times a year, there's a whole group effort. Everyone's involved in different aspects to create and put on and produce dramatic presentations in the Greek theater. This becomes a really important element within, again, this first cycle or this first cultural period. And those plays put on there take pretty much only in two areas: Greek tragedy, Greek plays, and then Shakespeare. And you could say today, Shakespeare is the modern evolution sourced in the Greek elements. So what was this for? What was this about? So I'm just writing here. The drama at Point Loma during the period from 1898 to 1929 could be said to be one of the central arenas for psychological unfoldment. The two areas of focus were Greek tragedy and Shakespeare's plays. The understanding of the nature of tragedy and redemption in the Eumenides and in the plays of Aeschylus and Euripides, the nature of hubris, the experiencing and participation, the archetypal elements in Shakespeare, all of these factors entered into and helped form the inner life at Point Loma. So they actually put together a composite play called The Aroma of Athens. They made up real dialogues between historical figures that never knew each other to create certain ideas present. It's one example. And this was put on frequently at Point Loma. And it was, of course, inviting the whole community from the city and surrounding areas would come, participate. There'd be write-ups in the newspaper. And then they would give a lot of the Shakespearean dramas. She especially liked to do the Midsummer's Night's Dream, also in The Tempest, but many of the other plays as well. I know, for children and for everyone participating, it was really an extraordinary event. It's like they made all their own costumes. They would perform live music. There would be the orchestra hidden in back of the Greek theater. There was a space there. So you would have music coming out of nowhere for the Midsummer's Night's Dream, for example. So really quite, and then from the canyon below, there would be, I think in The Aroma of Athens, there would be a torchlight procession, coming into the theater. It's very dramatic, very powerful, kind of transformative experience, especially for everyone involved, the children, adults, everybody really had a great experience with that. All the people I knew growing up all had some roles in drama at some time or another. So I hear stories, or making the costumes, doing the makeup and all those things. And Catherine Tingley was always directly involved there in the middle with every aspect of the drama. For her, this was where she felt most engaged, most involved as a teacher. Yeah.
I have a question. If everyone of Point Loma was involved in the drama, who was the audience? Were that people from San Diego?
Yes. People would come from near and far to watch the dramas. It's not in each production. You wouldn't say everyone at Point Loma was involved in the production, but it would rotate. So there would always be some who were and some who were not. But yeah, there's at that time, San Diego was relatively small, and so this was a huge cultural probably the predominant cultural center of San Diego was the things like this going on at Point Loma. They did have ISIS theater downtown for part of that time, and but that was mostly used for talks and presentations. Actually, there were some dramas given there, but not so much. Yeah.
What is the ISIS theater now?
It is no, it's gone. It became, I think, when was it torn down? 50s? Yeah.
What was it when it was torn down?
Spreckles? No.
The Spreckles is still there.
Spreckles is still there. ISIS was it became, I'm not sure, I don't remember at the moment. Yeah, well, before that it was gone though. Yeah, long before.
Were there, at the time of Point Loma, still lodges over the rest of the U.S., and how did it function? Because Point Loma, it's quite isolated. So how did she attract people or? Oh
yeah, well,
spread Theosophy. Yeah.
Tingley in the movements of energies in the late 1890s, she consolidated a great deal. Everything she could was headed into one point. So many lodges probably disappeared in that time, but there were still also many, and virtually almost every year she was headed to Europe or somewhere, Japan, at least once. Across the U.S., always, on the way to and back from Europe. Cuba was in the first part of it's another element in the linear history, is the development of the Rodrigo schools in Cuba from about the early 1900s to about 1912. And if there's a downside to Catherine Tingley in some ways is that she would try to do too much. So the financial drain on attempting to do the Cuban schools was enormous. Yeah, I tried to figure it out in terms of our modern day monetary numbers, but it was probably something like, would translate out today to something like $15 or $20 million went into Cuba. She had support there from Emilio Bacardí, and who she met when coming back from her India trip I just mentioned. In the various, again, the supportive side of the elements in Cuba came mostly from Masonic connections with Theosophy. There was some mild opposition from Catholic Church there, but she pushed past it as usual. Earlier, she had been very much sent. They had what they called the Universal Brotherhood League. This was like the active aspect of the society, and that was, they sent people and support and all kinds of effort because of the problems after the Spanish-American War had left Cuba in quite a bad state. That was kind of her motivation with all that. And then the reverse side is probably about 100 to 200 students came from Cuba to Point Loma for education at no charge, no. So there was a whole period during that 1900 to 1920 or late teens where there were a large number of Cuban children came to Point Loma.
I'm kind of curious. A living organization needs to interact and communicate with the outside world, right? And we know that there was scholars and artists visiting, and KT did a lot of tours. And there was the drama, of course. But at the same time, if you want to lay a strong foundation, you need to have some kind of isolation, I guess, for some period of time to build something. So I'm kind of curious, was there any kind of policy or rules or principles Since there was no cell phones or internet, that was easy, right? But was there anything, any kind of rules for the people living there that they had to live by? In terms of interacting with the outside world, communicating with the outside world, any kind of policy there that you know of?
Yeah, I think you could say there were probably many things. Of course, there was extraordinary discipline, you could call it, or limits on the community. And then on the other side, there was a great deal of engagement with the outer world. So I have several layers to answer your question. So for example, there was the magazine for the children, there was a magazine for prisoners, but not only a magazine for prisoners, but in the Tingley view, very interesting things. So every Sunday, children at Point Loma quotations from inspirational literature would be written, and very nicely, and rolled up perhaps, and then tied with flowers, and would go to every prisoner in San Diego. It's very different, very interesting. And then Tingley in the one period also is extremely, she takes on strong views on social issues, very particular ones, not a broad scope, but extremely particular ones. So she's very much against the death penalty. And again, into the prisons and with students at one point, even through the Brotherhood League aspect, I think they actually are giving lectures against capital punishment throughout California and Arizona. And it's mind-boggling through that influence with Governor Hunt in Arizona in the early 20s or late teens. Actually, the death penalty was repealed in Arizona at that time. I mean, it's back in full force in Arizona now. It wouldn't have a chance of that happening in Arizona today. But she managed to get it reversed in a time period we would seem as much more, it was still the Wild West practically at that time in Arizona. Anyway, so in terms of the community rule, there are some areas where it's kind of laid out, But then, for example, one Theosophist shared with me right before World War I, and again, Tingley is very much opposed to World War I. She's sending telegrams to Woodrow Wilson. I mean, in the entire country, almost nobody was doing this. It was very, what's the word? I mean, especially when World War I actually began, to oppose the war was a little problematic. There was the government was not tolerant of that view at all, but she had enough influence where she could get away with it somehow. She proposes the Peace Day of Nations. Well, as soon as she proposed that, what's very interesting is that then it was after that, Wilson then proposes the same thing.
What of nations?
Peace Day of Nations, world peace. Anyway, so these are elements where she's engaged in the outer world, but again, in terms of this one Theosophist shared with me, she gathered the community together right on the edge of World War I, and she requested that because it was an international community representing dozens of nations, and all the nations of Europe were present at Point Loma, even those that were soon to be fighting each other, she asked them not to read the news during the war, because she didn't want to have any acrimony or conflict at Point Loma. So everyone's agreeing, and then there was one, I don't know her name, but one German woman living there raised her hand and said if she could read the newspaper, if that would be okay. And Tingley said, yes, for you that would be okay. So there was flexibility in the framework, but still it was quite a different world. There could be a much longer answer. I mean, that's just like a little, yeah.
Was there maybe what he was suggesting? Was there any kind of ashramic? This is the sacred place. Don't go out in the corrupt ward. Try to stay away from corrupt San Diego. That sort of notion or mind.
I think it was infused into the daily practice. Like, for example, there was also a part of Point Loma. It was a high point. I can show you when they were there later, where they were to establish the very long name, School for the Revival of the Lost Mysteries of Antiquity. This would be this place for the future school. They had pictures drawn. They had a special ceremony there. They even had some things buried in the ground there in a box, for the future. And during that particular area, for example, it was absolute. When you were walking across that area, there would be absolute silence, no talking. One would be very mindful and aware that this is the most sacred place on Point Loma, and this was kept as a practice. This location was very special for that reason. So you can think, well, this is kind of strange, in one way. We think today in our modern life. But what an interesting way as an element to know oneself. What if we had a piece in our home where we were always silent and aware without any mind chatter or distraction like that? So these kinds of things pervaded the point there. And then there were also, and I don't have them here, I think we should post them online, Joachim, is Catherine Tingley wrote, and it's really like the praxis or the practice for Point Loma, is that there was read at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day. And it starts off something like, let us begin the day with noble thoughts, for all humanity. And it's quite a wonderful thing. It's really quite, and then again, before the meals, there was short things read, to engage the silence and be aware that we are gathered here at Point Loma to, the motivation was to serve humanity always. It was inculcated. Even the smallest duty done well, the smallest activity done well, had benefit for the whole world, for everyone. And that, like, this upliftment of humanity was a pervasive atmosphere and cultural force, which was really quite unusual, I think. Sally?
I know we have copies of that, but can copies be made available that people could use? Because that is a wonderful reading.
Yeah.
We were, that's something I keep by my bed.
If you see what you explained to us in the, let's say, the lesser mystery school level,
Yeah.
that will certainly generate a type of mentality, a certain way of view of life, and let's say acting for yourself. That is one thing. Another thing is, and that is a criticism, what I get quite often, that people say, yeah, but you have to realize by growing up and training yourself in such isolation, you are not able to cope with the real world, as they call it.
Oh, yeah.
So, certainly not new to you. That is one thing that can you say a few words about that? Because for myself, I can understand some people maybe are living this way of life, are not able to cope with the real world. But on the other hand, if you look to KT, de Purucker and so on, a lot of other people, they have to deal really with a lot of real world problems. Quite some challenges.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, the proof was in the pudding, yes, in how things unfolded. So at the Well, there are two periods historically, again, where there's due to economic factors and other things in 1929, all kinds of Tingley dies, there's economic problems globally, there's economic problems at Point Loma. And so under de Purucker, he has to downsize. So then numbers of people, who have been living at Point Loma for 20 and 30 years have to leave. It's a very difficult decision for him to make. So at that time, for example, Kenneth Morris returns to Wales. And there are several numbers of other people, not so well known, return to wherever they came from, Europe, America, and places. And of course, that was more difficult just because of the global economy. But in other ways, it was Kenneth Morris only saw it as an exciting wonder. He wrote, "Have you heard the good news? I'm returning to Wales." He was very excited. Later, when Point Loma dissolves, which is not within the scope of our talk at all, but and then numbers of people, of course, then end up in the real world. And I don't know one story of anyone who had much difficulty. There were difficulties in transition, in just getting started sometimes, but in terms of themselves and entering...
Started the East-West Cultural Center, came out of Point Loma.
Yeah, Judith Tyberg is an example, yeah. Judith Tyberg started the East-West Cultural Center. So, but Iverson Harris became the personal secretary to the president of the Santa Fe Railway, executive secretary in a sense. They'd never found such people that had such abilities, basically. Here were groups of people who, on conventional typewriters could type 100 words a minute, take shorthand, speak several languages, depending on their interests, either had great literary or science ability. Yeah, they could do whatever they wanted to in some ways, in many ways. Helen Todd was secretary to the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. It's very interesting. People had some very ordinary jobs, many different stories. Some were in business. There's the curious story, everyone's familiar with our movie rating system. Well, very surprisingly, at least in the United States, up until just after World War II, in the early 50s, they overtly referred to the person's job as the censor. Movies were censored, probably in Europe also in different ways, but in the US they were. And there was someone who had that job. They changed the name because that was not a very good name for the job, motion picture industry. So I think probably by about 1960, early 60s, someone proposed, well, no, we shouldn't censor things anymore, but we can give them a grading system. And I think it was simpler to begin with. Well, surprisingly, the person who made this change and pulled it off in Hollywood was a man named Jeffrey Sherlock, who had grown up at Point Loma, born in England. He had gone to the Rajayoga school and had lived at Point Loma, probably the first 20 years of his life. Later, when he was being honored by the motion picture industry, they were at one of the theaters in Hollywood that was, I think, the famous Egyptian theater, right, with all the designs on the outside. So, and he was about probably 80 years old then. And he started reading the Egyptian to everyone assembled, because that was one of his main interests, was he studied Egyptian hieroglyphics at Point Loma to the point where he could read them fluently. So there's some really unusual characters came out of Point Loma that are not so well known. They didn't necessarily write anything special later or anything like that. So a lot of stories I can get off on sidetracks, so you have to... So this was all the foundation. So in a very short, condensed way, I will try to talk about the second part. The second part, again, these are not separate parts, really. Lesser mysteries, greater mysteries. But as Purucker says in many places, Catherine Tingley was a great esotericist. She laid the foundation for this work that he could then do, which was very special, a very rare kind of occurrence over a very short period of time, just a little more than a dozen years, 12-year period. There was, under difficult financial circumstances, due to world conditions and other things, there was this opportunity took place, and Purucker filled it up very quickly with, and had, again, people assembled that could do the work to support in harmony with what he was working on. Just as an example, like these 12 booklets were from the talks to the Esoteric group over a period of about a year and a half, 63 weeks. They were issued as little separate papers first, just transcribing Purucker's talks. 63 weeks starting in summer 1929 after Catherine Tingley died. That ends, and then Purucker puts together through the two people to coordinate the reconstruction of those talks then into a usable teaching series as Helen Harris and Boris Tzurkov. So then in a short period of perhaps a little over, and again, another year and a half or so, maybe 2 years, those 63 talks given to the Esoteric group are transformed into 12 books. And this is the first one. And again, issued out for private study to esoteric students, not public. That's all happening simultaneously with other material that's being published for use in all the other lodges and study groups and things as well. And then first amongst these books, again, is the Esoteric Path. The first two, in a way, especially, the Esoteric School, the second part. So this lays the foundation for the inner aspect, using this model, roughly, the inner aspect of what you could call the greater mysteries. So again, there's this foundation amongst the students at Point Loma from Catherine Tingley's time. And then Purucker offers this opportunity to understand the broad scope of Theosophical teachings on a deeper level, and also the personal, individual effort to engage those things in practice, or what they would call chelaship, the path of the disciple. So de Purucker gives the key elements and foundations for the engaging of the path of chelaship, or walking of the inner path, with a few key statements, which are in here. As GDP states, the entire training for chelaship is founded on psychological factors illumined by spiritual and intellectual aspiration. He also says, these are very interesting and unusual key core statements all here. Chelaship is a matter of being, not of talking about being. Chelaship is a matter of growth, of inner evolution, in fact of being, and is by no means a matter of emotion, however beautiful. The path of Chelaship is the path leading to becoming utterly at one with one's own spiritual essence. Then complementary to that also, though, is the path of Chelaship is service. One of the fundamental teachings of our philosophy is to teach men their essential oneness with the boundless all. Complementing Catherine Tingley's statement, wisdom comes not from the multiplication of spoken or written instruction. Wisdom comes from the performance of duty and in the silence, and only the silence expresses it. Again, in here, it's a very interesting part for me. I think it's very profound. In the beginning, first parts of this book, where, again, they insert and they quote also from earlier teachings given by Catherine Tingley to private group. So Catherine Tingley is being quoted here, and it's very, very deep, where she says, have you ever thought who or what is this I, this self, that takes the pledge? This is the pledge to the esoteric students, to the higher self. So who is this I? What is myself and what my life? Have you meditated on that higher self to which you pledge yourself and to which you aspire? This thought and meditation is the first step to an understanding of the real nature of the inner and outer man. It clarifies your whole being, unloading and separating from you much that you have hitherto thought to be yourself. Yeah, so this is very, very deep process. This is not very, a lot of work is implied in it. I mean, inner work is implied in this, these very, very core statements here. Yeah, Richard.
Yes, so how do these 12 books or booklets differ from the dialogues?
All these simple questions. Well, they came first. They are foundational. And within the 12, the first two are foundational in how they were sent out to students. It would really, you know, if one goes, oh, I think I like subject number hierarchies or emanations, or oh, after death's so interesting, I want to study that. Well, this wouldn't have happened in the esoteric school when they were delivered. I don't know if we made this clear somewhere, but everyone had, this was read first. They were sent out and returned. Sent out, so they'd be sent out, you receive it, you had a period probably of a 1 month or a seasonal period, perhaps. Yeah. So a very short time. Internationally, it would have been true that those people representing the esoteric school in other countries would have all had copies and sent them out. But still the same format would have followed. So the interrelationship would be then that this is foundational and more important is not the right word, but it's essential to digest before studying these other aspects, and that would include everything that's in dialogues. Because really it's only in 1 and 2 here that you have the unfolding and the intricate and subtle balancing points given by Purucker to understand how to stay balanced in entering this path. You know, ethical guidelines are given, but they're given very carefully. You know, what is this all about? It's really quite profound and very helpful. Yeah.
I found in this light number 10 also very important.
Oh yeah, the way of compassion. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
That is the reason that in the Netherlands we have translated 1, 2, and 10.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's true. Absolutely.
Yeah.
You have to translate what? You have translated
1, number 2, because that was in the tradition that you have to study them first. And then we decided what will be the next one, and then we chose number 10. Because from compassion point of view, that is a very important one.
Yeah. Skipping around, I wrote too much here, but so one saying that Purucker, this is not written anywhere, so I want to share this, because it may be somewhere, but I don't remember, but it was, he had ways of expressions that would come up frequently in interacting with people. And one of them was, and of course he was a polyglot, he knew maybe 10 languages quite fluently. And you know, his education in Europe, speaking most of the European languages fluently, and then Latin and Greek. You know, he translated the Bible as a present to his father. I forget what it was now. Was it from the Greek? Yeah. When he was 12. But one of his favorite sayings was from Seneca. It's est modus in rebus. There is a middle way in all things, or there is a proper measure in all things, or there is the golden mean to be observed in all things. So this was a very core and part of his method. He was an extremely balanced force, always, a balanced in his expression and how he worked with people and his whole interactions. This, you know, how he composed things was very much based on this one quote from Seneca that he liked so much. There's this proper measure or balance point in all activities, in all the teachings, in all the way of engaging these teachings, these high teachings. There's this balanced place to find always. I mean, if I go more now, then it's too much, I think.
No, I had another question.
Yeah.
If you look in the time period of Gottfried Tingley to, let's say, the Great Mystery School effects and education, can you say that during that time of Gottfried Tingley there was already an inner group active and studying in a certain level? Or was it not there, and was it only coming, let's say, in effect or in practice during the time of GDP?
Yeah. Well, again, there are two ways of looking at this. One is historically, and then the other is kind of as a almost archetypal template to direct our own study with. But historically, certainly, I mean, even as you can see, the quote I just took from this book, where Tingley's talking about the relationship of the I to this higher self. This is taken from probably early 1900s, esoteric teachings that she gave to small groups. So it did exist, yes. Yeah. I'm answering very simply there. I mean, it's a little more complicated.
Extending this question is, and you are absolutely aware of it, speaking with Carl, he's a Freemason, he's very much in favor of that. He was giving the information to me that even during the time of KT, all the male people, or not all the male people, but all the male persons in KT's time having a certain function should be in Freemason. And he tried to tell me that even GDP's times was extending that, and GDP was in Freemason as well. That last one is, for me, totally new.
Yeah, during Catherine Tingley's time, it was encouraged, and all of her cabinet, members of her cabinet, mostly were men anyway, and all of them, I believe, had to be Freemasons. Both my mother's father and my father's father were Freemasons. But they may have been anyway, but I think it was more than encouraged, certainly under Tingley, and there were a lot of reasons for it. And certainly her connection, for example, with Emilio Bacardi in Cuba, as he was the head of the Masonic movement in Cuba at the time, was crucial there. So those elements she worked with a lot. However, I'm quite certain that under Purucker, the cabinet members were not required to be Freemasons. I'm quite sure of that.
What was the cabinet?
The board of directors.
And what was JJP doing before he became president after Tingley's death? What was he doing under Tingley?
Oh, for example, and there's some, I brought a couple of the bound volumes. Purucker was the editor of the Theosophical Path. I think it's always something to remember that perhaps one of his greatest works was the fact that he was editor of the Theosophical Path from 1911 to 1929. You know, I mean, Tingley's name is there, but Purucker 100% composed and selected and, you know, asked and invited people to write things. So, you know, I'm sure many things we have there are because he would say to, you know, Fritz Darrow, the Greek scholar, could you please send me something on the Orphic Mysteries? And he did. Or Mr. Malpas, could you please send me something on this subject? Or Kenneth Morris, could you please write these lectures from your classes are very good. Would you write it so we can publish it? Purucker, quietly behind everything, was relating and connecting, I mean, very invisibly. He was totally invisible at Point Loma. It's really one thing people don't realize. Completely invisible. I mean, really, there's a very funny story I have to tell. Because also he followed a real different regime than everyone else too. At 9 p.m. every night, regardless of what was going on, he would walk over to Catherine Tingley and excuse himself and say, "Good night, Katie." Every day, never, you know, whatever she had going on, and everyone else had to be there. He was the exception, the only exception, and he would excuse himself at 9 o'clock every day. Among other things, you know, this wasn't because he was going back to his room to do more work on the Theosophical Path. So then there was a man from Sweden there, and he was very confused. He says, "Where is Professor Purucker going?" He asked Catherine Tingley. So then she turned to him and she said, "Oh, don't you know? He's going to his wife and 7 children." And then later my father recounts, he says, the man was always saying, "You know, it's so strange. I've never seen his wife or his 7 children." It is quite funny. Yeah, but he had to attend to them, every night at 9.
During this period, of course, we did have all of HPB's esoteric instructions and judges' esoteric instructions, and they obviously were not ignored since GDP did reference those, so they must have been used.
Yeah, and those were, I've seen bound volume that was Catherine Tingley's personal copy, for example. And certainly those circulated amongst a small group at Point Loma in the earlier time period.
So we know there's all these books like What Would Steve Jobs Do? Maybe we can start a weblog on KT. And nice first question might be if KT were alive today and wanted to revive Theosophy in California, where would she start?
Where would Catherine Tingley start?
Yeah. Knowing what you know about KT?
Well, part of her, at least one element in her life, she'd probably start on on Skid Row and with the homeless in Los Angeles, where we have something like LA County has 80,000 people that are homeless. It's quite unbelievable. But in comparing that to her New York period, when she first meets Mr. Judge, that's where she would have begun, most likely, something like that. Now, of course, that took different form as she entered with a more theosophical period. I don't know, certainly I think the same issues she would continue, the anti-capital punishment, the peace work, all those things would have stayed the same with her for sure. Today, she was very skillful, in that. She continued the peace, they would have peace parades, but they weren't like anything you could ever think of. I mean, they had huge quotes from The Voice of the Silence, and they had Raja Yoga students with garlands of flowers, and it was completely apolitical, except for the timing. I'm sure the governmental authorities were horrified, but somehow she didn't get in trouble with it. She kept it as non-political as she could, at the same time addressing the issues. Prison reform, certainly there's a lot going on now that would be part of her vision on those practical measures. The elements, incorporated in Point Loma just in its lifestyle. Of course, they grew all of their fruits and vegetables and more. There was probably, I think, 20, 30 acres of Point Loma was just fruit trees. Introduced the avocado to America. So those elements would continue. Certainly it was a very ecological zone. Other elements of this, I'll post online some things I've worked on going through and making a kind of outline and comment of key core elements of the first volume here to help give and adding in some other current support to understanding of those things from other writers that can be helpful. So for example, in the broad sense where Purucker is talking about being, then we have the very wonderful psychologist from the 70s and 80s, Erich Fromm. Erich Fromm wrote a number of great books, but one of his books fits exactly with this understanding, which is his wonderful book called To Have or To Be. So in our society today, this idea of acquisition and grasping onto things and acquiring and having that create our identity, Fromm undoes this very skillfully and talks about the relationship between having and being. So that's a very in a deeper way, this goes into the same thing, but it jumps right into it, but sometimes we have to step back and see where we are and where we're starting from and get more depth and support around understanding those things. So that's just one thought I had to elaborate. Of course, there are many other sources. Nicholas was talking about the paramitas, and there are many sources available today that were not available in the 1930s that can give us a lot of insight and support in understanding that ethical framework from Mahayana Buddhism. So there are many pieces and parts here that are very useful. Anyway, we could go on and unfold, but we can continue as we walk across Point Loma. And I put up here some magazines from the Historical Society, San Diego Historical Society, that were focused on Point Loma. And there's Greenwald's book. And then there's a couple of the Theosophical Path issues there. I just put there because I didn't have time to do make copies available of some of the pictures from the drama. So you can see the costuming and some of the pictures there as well. So I think that's enough for now. We can continue more. There's a lot can come later.
Good. Okay.